Alright, the last section of this unit is the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution was all about the movement from farms to cities and the idea that machines were being developed and machines replaced individuals on the farms, so they were no longer needed, which means they no longer have a job. As a result, they are going to have to move to cities in order to find a job in the factories where they are producing goods and machines. As a result, you have the rise of cities and the rise of our modern world. So the Industrial Revolution began in England, which you can see in the map. First of all, why in the world did it start in England? Okay, what made England so special, or the primary spot for such a major and important revolution that could still possibly be going on today? Why in the world did it happen in England? Why did it start there? First of all, there are a lot of natural resources. Okay, but, like, plain and simple, they have enough natural resources in order to make goods. If you look at the map, there's a lot of rivers. Okay, so rivers equal water power. They also had coal. They had iron ore. The rivers not only provided power, but they also provided a method of transportation. England is on a very large island that is surrounded by water, and so out on the coast, they can have harbors for shipping internationally. And to top it off, they had a lot of farms covering England's landscape. And so that's a lot of people that are no longer needed on the farms, and they're going to have to move to the cities in order to find jobs. By the time the Industrial Revolution starts in about 1750. Alright, so as far as farming is concerned, you had a lot of wealthy landowners that ended up buying all this farmland, and they put up a fence around it, which is called enclosement, or an enclosure. And so they started to experiment with the fields that they had in order to increase the amount of crops, or the crop yields that they had each year, or each season. And they also forced some farms to kind of like give up their job, and they're like, hey, we don't need you anymore. You're good. Get out of here. You're fired. And so those now unemployed farmers, they got to go to the city because they're not needed on the farm anymore if they're going to still supply, or if they're still going to provide for their family. And so a lot of them became factory workers. And so in order to experiment with the crop yields on these farms, these wealthy landowners experimented with crop rotation, which you can see in the map, or I'm sorry, in the picture. Let's say you have 3 different fields here, okay? Let's say this year, you're going to plant barley in this one, wheat in this one, and then this one, you're just going to let it sit. That way the nutrients can, redevelop in that soil. And then the following year, where you had barley, you're now going to let this fallow out. And then this one's going to be barley, and this one's going to be wheat. And then you're going to rotate it again the following year, to where you're not planting barley in this field every year, you're actually doing it every 3 years. Now this is going to allow that soil to sit for a year and allow that nutrients to come back. And some crops are harsher on the soil than others are. And so you don't want the same crop to be, grown in the same field every single year. And so that's why they started to rotate it, which is going to lead to additional crops. Alright, so you have several inventors during the Industrial Revolution. The first one is Jethro Tull, and he's going to invent the seed drill. And so he realized that, hey, all these seeds that we're putting out it's not effective, it's not being productive. Probably at least half the seeds that farmers were throwing out into their soil, they weren't sprouting, and so that's a waste. And so the seed drill actually allowed farmers to space the seeds out and more effectively plant the seeds to where they have more crops. Bottom line, more seeds sprouted, and so they have more crops. Really simple. But it is going to lead to more crops, which can can support a larger population. So Robert Bakewell, he also started working with farm animals, as far as which ones they were going to breed. Okay, like he only allowed his best sheep in order to breed, so he had better meat, larger pieces of meat, healthier meat. And the result of all of these farming revolutions is that they had more food. Okay, if you have more food, you can support a higher population. And if they're better foods, you're going to have a higher demand for those foods and goods. All right, one of the first industries to move from the homes and the cottages to the factories is going to be textile, so like cotton or fabric. So as a result, you have a lot of the first inventions that are associated with spinning or a loom to make some kind of textile or to make some kind of fabric. So first of all, you have James Hargreaves. So he's going to invent the spinning wheel or the spinning jenny, which is this picture right on top. Richard Arkwright is going to invent the water frame, which is used to generate water power. And that is this image right down here. Samuel Crompton is going to take the spinning jenny and the water frame together and make the spinning mule. So kind of the two machines put together. And then Edmund Cartwright, he is going to invent the very first power loom. Okay, this is really going to speed up the process of weaving material. So all of these machines officially allowed the process of making tiles to move from cottages to factories, which is going to expedite that process, which means that you can produce more textile in a shorter amount of time. So James Watt is going to invent the steam engine, and Robert Fulton is going to take that steam engine, and he's going to create the steamboat. So after you have all of these goods being produced in England, not everybody in England is going to need them, and so they can make more money by exporting those goods or taking them to different cities within England. So they need a way to transport them. And at this time, prior to the invention of the locomotive, you had the rivers, okay, and the rivers was going to be the fastest way to travel. And the steamboat is going to expedite that process as well. So the Clermont was one of the first steam engines in the U.S., and it ferried passengers up the Hudson River in New York. Even though this was an extremely slow trip compared to our standards today, this was a record-breaking trip up the Hudson River with a steamboat. All right, so after you have the locomotive, or I'm sorry, after you have the steam engine, you also have the development of the locomotive or the railway. And this is going to be completely revolutionary to the transportation system. So rather than having to follow the path of a river, which might twist and turn and go all sorts of directions, you can build a railroad, which you can actually determine which way that railroad is going to go in the building process. So up here in between Carlisle and Newcastle, you can see that this railroad goes fairly straight. Okay, let's say there's a river in here. That river might go down to the south and then go back up and just twist and turn. It might even take a huge loop right here and then finally get to Newcastle. Now, even though, like, you can't always have a straight railroad, like sometimes it does have natural or physical barriers in the way, but for the most part, you can build the railroad wherever you want to go. And so George Stephenson is going to work on the world's very first railroad line, which is going to be between Liverpool and Manchester in England. And you can see that right down here, this railroad between Manchester, where the 3 is, all the way out to Liverpool. And so if they have a lot of factories here in Manchester, they're going to need to get them out here to Liverpool, where there's a harbor, so they can then export all these goods that they're making. All right, so the locomotive was extremely important to 1800s and even into the 1900s, the transportation. It is going to lead to industrial growth because the manufacturers have a cheaper and more affordable way to transport their goods, and so they're going to be able to make more money. The creation of the railroad also is going to create hundreds of thousands of jobs. You need people to build, you need people to maintain, you need people to run the railroads, and you need people to change where 2 of them intersect, change the course. There's all sorts of different things that they needed people for on the railway. And so that's going to create a lot of jobs. And it really just made traveling easier, going back to the idea of traveling on the river compared to the railway. Okay, it was just a lot faster. So urbanization, okay, again, is that process of moving from the farms to the cities. And with the Industrial Revolution, you have the huge rise of these big cities like Los Angeles and New York City, London, Philadelphia, Detroit, St. Louis, okay, all of these major cities that most of them are settled on a river, okay, because that's the way that these cities needed to be. They needed to have a transportation option. And so you have a huge population moving because of all these goods. Okay, there's more goods, more food, even more services, and so that can support a larger population. However, okay, the first cities, they weren't like the cities that we have today. They didn't have any kind of development plan. They didn't have a sewer system. They didn't have any kind of sanitation. They didn't have housing or education or hospitals, any kind of public services. As a result, homes were extremely dirty. Okay, the lack of electricity, they were dark, they were small, they were crowded. It wasn't uncommon to have like a 1 to 2 bedroom apartment and have 6 or 7 families living in there. And if they have to go to the bathroom, there's no plumbing. And so they would have a bucket, and then they have to take that bucket somewhere once they need to empty it. And most of the time, it would end up on the streets where people are walking. And just the overall hygiene was extremely poor in these newly industrialized cities. And so if the hygiene's really low, it's going to lead to sickness. And cholera, which is a digestive type disease that was very, very widespread due to the poor hygiene in these cities. So that was not like the wealthy people were living like that though. Okay, it was the middle and the working class had to live in the dirty, non-hygienic cities. Meanwhile, the people who were making the money, the merchants, the factory owners, they were building these huge luxurious homes outside the city so they didn't have to be living in the more filthy conditions. On top of that, you have horrible working conditions. Okay, I mean, like today, people complain about a 40-hour work week and an 8-hour day. Okay, during the Industrial Revolution, you would have 14-hour days, if not longer, and you would have to do that 6 days a week, sometimes 7 days a week. The reason that we have a 40-hour work week is because of the conditions of the Industrial Revolution. They decided to change it. There was poor lighting. Okay, if you're working with big machines and there's poor lighting, that's going to result in injuries. They were dirty, which again is going to cause the overall health to decline. There weren't safety precautions. Okay, like today you go to work, there's safety signs all over the place. You walk into your science lab, there's safety signs all over the place. Even in my classroom, okay, you have the exit or the emergency map, okay, to show you where to go to be safe in the case of an emergency. They didn't have that kind of stuff back then. Things had to happen. People had to get hurt in order for the government to require different safety precautions to be taken. One of the most dangerous areas were the coal mines. Okay, people would be working in the coal mines for hours on end, and they were breathing in the coal, which isn't good for you, and so that led to shortened lifespans in a lot of cases. So the people who kind of were at the lower, who kind of went through all these poor working conditions and living conditions were primarily the working class. And even the middle class in some cases. They were the ones who were finally going to fight for equality and better working conditions and things of that nature. Eventually, the Industrial Revolution is going to spread out of England. It's going to spread into Europe during the 1800s, and it's even going to expand into North America. And there's a really big question as far as, did the Industrial Revolution ever end? Because we're constantly changing. We are constantly increasing industrialization. So as far as when did it end, that's a really large debatable question.